You're just dead weight, Dad. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. My son Marcus didn't even look up from his phone as he delivered the verdict. You're only getting in the way, Dad. Sit down and stay quiet, my daughter Sarah added, her voice carrying that particular brand of exhaustion reserved for dealing with inconvenient burdens. For months, I absorbed their contempt like a sponge soaking up dirty water. And when I finally asked them one simple question, the silence that followed was so profound, you could hear their world cracking at the foundation. Sometimes, all it takes is reminding them of what they chose to forget. Before we continue, please subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Absolutely not reasonable, Dad. The heating bills alone are killing you, Rebecca was saying, her fingers drumming against her coffee cup in that rapid-fire way she'd inherited from her mother. Around the dining table, my family had arranged themselves like a tribunal, and somehow I'd become both judge and defendant. Natasha, Tyler's wife, leaned forward with her real estate agent's smile. The market analysis shows comparable properties selling within 6 weeks. Spring is prime selling season. But the garden is just coming into bloom, I said, gesturing toward the bay windows where my prize-winning roses were beginning to bud. I've been working on that landscaping for 13 years. Blake, Rebecca's husband, cleared his throat. He always did that before delivering what he considered wisdom. With respect, Dad, gardens don't pay property taxes. The casual dismissal stung like a paper cut, small but sharp. These roses had been Eleanor's favorite. I'd planted them the year after her funeral, when grief made me need something beautiful to tend. We're just being practical, Tyler added, not looking up from the spreadsheet he'd printed out. Numbers in neat columns, my life reduced to profit margins. You're rattling around in this big house. It doesn't make sense. It makes sense to me, I said, feeling heat rise in my chest. This is my home. The room's temperature seemed to shift. Rebecca and Natasha exchanged one of those looks. But then Natasha's expression softened. Maybe we're rushing this a little, she said quietly, touching Tyler's arm. I mean, Dad seems to be managing fine. The house looks beautiful. Tyler shot her a sharp look. Nat, we've been over this. I know, but, she started. Dad, Rebecca's voice cut through Natasha's gentle protest, taking on that careful, practiced patience she used with difficult clients. We're worried about you. Living alone, all this space to heat and cool, the maintenance. I maintain it just fine, I interrupted, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Last month, I retiled the entire guest bathroom, fixed the garage door opener, pruned every tree on the property. That's exactly what we're talking about, Tyler said, finally looking up. His expression held that familiar mix of frustration and condescension. You're 71 years old, climbing on ladders, doing electrical work. What happens when you fall? When you hurt yourself? The concern in his voice felt manufactured, like sympathy from a telemarketer. I could feel the conversation tilting, gaining momentum towards something I wasn't ready to face. Natasha shifted uncomfortably. Tyler, honey, maybe there's a middle ground here. Dad's obviously capable. A middle ground like what? Blake interrupted, his impatience showing. We can't keep having this conversation every few months. Blake nodded at his own wisdom. Golden Years Village just opened their new wing. It's really quite nice. They have activities, a dining room. The doorbell rang. The sound cut through our heated discussion like a referee's whistle, deflating the moment. We all turned toward the front hall, the spell of mounting conflict suddenly broken. Expecting someone, Dad? Rebecca asked, her lawyer voice replacing the concerned daughter act. I shook my head, grateful for the interruption. My pulse was racing, and I could feel sweat dampening my collar. These family meetings always left me feeling like I'd been in a boxing match. But as I rose to answer the door, something nagged at me. The way they'd all gone quiet. The way Tyler had quickly shuffled his papers together, like they'd been caught at something. The visitor at the door turned out to be Mrs. Chen from next door, apologizing for her cat getting into my garden again. A 5-minute conversation about neighborhood cats, but when I returned to the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted like weather before a storm. They were all seated exactly where I'd left them, but something was different. Too still. Too ready. Everything all right? I asked, settling back into my chair. Fine, Dad, Rebecca said, but her smile felt rehearsed. We were just talking. That pause, that careful word choice. My daughter, the lawyer, selecting her language like a surgeon choosing scalpels. About what? Tyler cleared his throat. Dad, we think it's time to be honest with you. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Natasha was studying her hands, her earlier attempts at defending me apparently forgotten. Blake had that self-satisfied expression he wore when he thought he was about to win an argument. Honest about what? I asked, though something cold was already spreading through my chest. About why we're really here, Rebecca said. Her voice had taken on that courtroom cadence, precise and merciless. It's not just about the house being too big, Dad. It's about you being. She paused, searching for the right word. The diplomatic word. Irresponsible, Tyler finished for her. The word hit like a physical blow. Irresponsible. Me, who had worked 3 jobs to put them both through college, who had sacrificed every vacation, every luxury, every moment of rest to give them what I never had. Irresponsible, I repeated slowly, tasting the accusation. With money, Blake added helpfully. The credit card bills, the home improvements, the donations to that animal shelter. Those are my choices to make, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Not when they affect our inheritance, but that, Tyler said. There it was, the truth finally naked and ugly in the afternoon light. I felt something inside me go very quiet, very still, like the moment before lightning strikes. Natasha shifted uncomfortably. Tyler, maybe we could. No, Nat, Rebecca cut her off. Dad needs to hear this. We've been enabling his habits for too long. Habits, as if caring about something other than money was an addiction. What habits? I asked, though I could feel the answer forming like storm clouds. The constant spending, Tyler said, consulting his spreadsheet like it was scripture. $15,000 on landscaping last year, $8,000 on that roof repair when a patch job would have been fine. The monthly donations to 3 different charities. 4, Blake corrected. I thought of Eleanor's garden, brought back to life with those flowers. I thought of the roof that no longer leaked during storms, protecting the home where my children had grown up safe and dry. I thought of the animal shelter where we'd found our family dog, Buddy, 20 years ago. Those weren't waste, I said quietly. They were if they're eating into what should be our security, Rebecca said. What happens when you need long-term care? When the money runs out, who do you think will have to cover the difference? Security. Their security. Built on my coffin. I looked around the table at these 4 people, 2 who had once been the center of my universe, 2 who had married into what I thought was our family, and I realized I was looking at strangers. So this isn't about my well-being, I said. It wasn't a question. Of course it is, Tyler said, but his eyes didn't meet mine. We want what's best for everyone, including you. The silence that followed was deafening, and in that silence I heard 30 years of my life recontextualized. Every sacrifice I'd made, every dollar I'd saved, every dream I'd deferred, it had all been investments in people who were now calculating the return. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor I'd refinished with my own hands. I think, I said, my voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. This meeting is over. Dad, don't be dramatic, Rebecca started, but I was already walking away, leaving them with their spreadsheets and their calculations and their plans for my life. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I could hear them whispering below. Urgent, worried whispers. They thought they'd won. They thought the old man would crumble, would submit, would hand over his keys and his dignity with grateful tears. They had no idea what they'd just awakened. I found myself in the garden at dawn, kneeling among Eleanor's roses with soil under my fingernails and clarity in my mind for the first time in months. The morning dew clung to the petals like tears, and I could almost hear her voice in the whisper of wind through the leaves. They don't remember, do they? I murmured to the climbing rose she'd loved most, gently pruning away the dead growth. They don't remember the nights I worked double shifts so Rebecca could have her law books, or when Tyler needed that surgery when he was 12 and we remortgaged the house to pay for the specialist. The rose seemed to lean into my touch, and for a moment I could swear Eleanor was there beside me, her hands guiding mine like she used to when she was teaching me to garden. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was having the clearest thoughts of my life while talking to flowers. But grief does strange things to a man, and sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. I moved to the next bush, my hands working automatically while my mind sorted through 30 years of memories like old photographs. Rebecca's college graduation, where she'd thanked me in her speech for believing in her dreams. The down payment I'd given Tyler and Natasha for their first house, $25,000 from my retirement fund because banks wouldn't approve their loan. They called it irresponsible spending, I told the yellow roses Eleanor had planted for our anniversary. But you remember, don't you? You remember when Rebecca called crying because her law school study group needed a place to meet, and we turned the dining room into their headquarters every weekend for 2 years. Made coffee, bought pizza, never complained about the noise. My fingers found a particularly stubborn weed, and I yanked it free with more force than necessary. Some things, once you see them clearly, need to be removed completely. Tyler's first business venture flashed through my mind, that food truck idea that failed spectacularly. I'd covered his losses, $8,000, without a word of reproach. Told him failure was just tuition for life's education. Eleanor had worried we couldn't afford it, but I'd insisted. It's not about the money, I'd told her. It's about not giving up on our son. Now our son was giving up on me. I sat back on my heels, surveying the garden that was coming alive around me. 13 years of careful cultivation, of learning which roses needed more water, which ones thrived in shade, which ones were hardy enough to survive the harsh winters. Not unlike raising children, I'd always thought. But there was a difference. Plants, when tended with love, grew more beautiful. Children, apparently, just grew more entitled. "What would you do, Elle?" I asked the morning air. "How do you fight people who see you as an obstacle to their—" A gentle knock on the garden gate interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Chen's worried face appeared around the corner, her silver hair catching the morning light. "Robert, I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice carrying that particular concern reserved for checking on neighbors who might be losing their minds. Heat flushed my cheeks. How long had I been talking to the roses out loud? Long enough for her to notice, apparently. "Mrs. Chen," I said, getting to my feet and brushing soil from my knees. "Not at all. Just doing some gardening." She stepped into the garden, her eyes taking in the pristine beds, the healthy roses, the obvious care I'd invested in this space. The roses look beautiful this year. Eleanor would be so proud. The mention of my wife's name from someone else's lips hit differently than my own internal dialogue. More real, more final. "I saw your family leave yesterday," she continued carefully. "They seemed upset about something. I felt my jaw tighten. Of course she'd noticed. Mrs. Chen noticed everything from her kitchen window. It was both blessing and curse of living next to someone who'd been widowed even longer than I had. "Family meetings," I said, attempting lightness. "You know how it is." "Actually," she said, settling herself on the garden bench Eleanor and I had installed for precisely these kinds of conversations, "I don't. My children live in California. They call every Sunday, send cards on holidays. But they've never once suggested I shouldn't live in my own home." Her words hung in the air like morning mist, delicate but penetrating. She'd heard more than I'd realized. "I couldn't help overhearing some raised voices," she admitted. "These old houses, the windows were open. I was worried about you." Worried about me. When was the last time my own children had used those words and meant them? I sat down beside her, suddenly exhausted. The clarity I'd felt while gardening was evaporating, replaced by something heavier. Loneliness, maybe, or the particular shame that comes with realizing your private humiliation has become neighborhood gossip. "They think I'm too old to take care of this place," I said finally. Mrs. Chen looked around the immaculate garden, then back at the house with its fresh paint and well-maintained exterior. "Are you?" Such a simple question, such a complicated answer. "I don't know anymore," I admitted. "Yesterday I thought I was fine. Today I feel like maybe they see something I don't." "Or maybe," Mrs. Chen said gently, "they see something that isn't there yet, but that they're in a hurry for." Her words hit like a key turning in a lock I didn't know was stuck. The phone rang from inside the house, its shrill tone cutting through our quiet garden conversation like a blade through silk. "I should get that," I said, starting to rise from the bench. Mrs. Chen placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Let it ring. If it's important, they'll call back." But the caller was persistent. 3 rings, a pause, then 3 more rings. My chest tightened. Only family called with that kind of urgency. "I'm sorry," I said to Mrs. Chen. "I'd better take this." By the time I reached the kitchen phone, it had started ringing again. "Hello? Dad!" Rebecca's voice was tight with forced cheer. "Good, you're home. Listen, we need to have another emergency family meeting. Tonight would be perfect. Blake's already cleared his schedule, and Tyler can. Emergency." Everything was always an emergency when it served their purposes. But when I'd needed emergency surgery for my gallbladder last year, it had taken them 3 days to visit. "I can't tonight," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Chen still sitting on the garden bench, politely pretending not to listen while obviously concerned. "What do you mean? You can't?" The disbelief in her voice was almost comical, as if the very idea of me having agency was foreign to her. "I have plans." "Plans." Rebecca's voice pitched higher. "What plans?" "Plans." Such a simple concept, yet she said it like I'd claimed to be running for president. "Personal plans." "Dad, this is important. We really need to finalize some decisions about your living situation. The Golden Years Village has a spot opening up, and if we don't move quickly, my living situation, not your home or your choice, my living situation, like I was a problem to be managed. And that phrase, we really need to finalize, when had my life become a business transaction that required their signatures?" "Tomorrow," I said firmly. "We can talk tomorrow." "But Dad, this opportunity won't wait. They need a deposit by Friday, and we need to discuss the financial arrangements." A deposit. They'd already put down money. My chest tightened with a mixture of rage and betrayal so intense I could taste copper in my mouth. I started to hang up, then hesitated. Something in Rebecca's tone made me pause, with the receiver still in my hand. Through the window, Mrs. Chen was watching me with growing concern, no doubt sensing the tension in my posture. I was about to set the phone down when I heard Rebecca's voice, distant but clear. She must have thought I'd already hung up. "Told you he sounded weird, Tyler. He never says no to family meetings. And did you hear how he said personal plans? Since when does Dad have personal plans?" Tyler's voice came through fainter. "Maybe he's finally losing it. That would actually make things easier." "Shh, keep your voice down." But Blake ran the numbers again. Even with the care facility costs, we're looking at significant money if we move quickly. My blood turned to ice. I gripped the phone tighter, afraid to breathe, afraid they'd realize I was still listening. "How quickly are we talking?" "Blake thinks we can have him relocated within 30 days if we can establish that he's not capable of making sound decisions. The question is whether he'll sign the power of attorney willingly or if we need to go the other route." "Yeah. The other route takes longer, doesn't it?" "Yes. But Blake says we have a solid foundation. The erratic spending patterns, living alone, talking to himself in the garden." Chen had risen from the bench and was now standing at the kitchen window, her face pale with understanding. Tyler's voice. "What about Natasha? She seemed uncomfortable yesterday." "Rebecca, Natasha will come around. She just needs to understand what's at stake here. This house alone is worth over $800,000 and Dad's just bleeding money on maintenance and those ridiculous donations." A click. They'd finally hung up. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the phone in my trembling hand. The silence stretched between Mrs. Chen and me through the glass, heavy with the weight of what we'd both just witnessed. I slowly hung up and walked back outside to the garden bench. "I'm so sorry," I said finally. "You shouldn't have had to hear that." Mrs. Chen stood up slowly, her face set in lines I'd never seen before. When she spoke, her voice carried the steel of someone who'd survived the Depression and buried 2 husbands. "Robert," she said, "I think it's time you stopped asking what Eleanor would do and started asking what you're going to do." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I knew exactly what that was. The roses swayed in the afternoon breeze, and I could swear I heard Eleanor's voice in the rustling leaves. "Show them, Robert. Show them what happens when you underestimate a man who has nothing left to lose." "Mrs. Chen," I said, my voice steady as granite, "would you mind staying for dinner? I have a feeling I'm going to need a witness for what comes next." Mrs. Chen stayed for dinner, as I'd asked. We ate quietly at first, the weight of what we'd overheard settling between us like an unwelcome third guest. But as the evening progressed, something shifted in me. The shock was crystallizing into something harder, more focused. "They think I'm losing my mind," I said finally, setting down my fork. Talking to myself in the garden. The irony was bitter as black coffee. I'd been talking to Eleanor, to the roses she'd loved, trying to hold on to the last pieces of the life we'd built together. Now it was evidence of my incompetence. Mrs. Chen looked at me steadily. "Are you? Losing my mind?" I considered the question seriously. "No, but I think I've been losing myself." That night, after Mrs. Chen had gone home with promises to check on me tomorrow, I sat in my study, Eleanor's old sewing room that I'd converted after she died. The walls were lined with photo albums, financial records, and boxes of memories I'd been too sentimental to throw away. But sentiment was a luxury I could no longer afford. I pulled out the folder containing my will, my insurance papers, the deed to the house, everything they thought they were entitled to. Then I opened my laptop and began to research. Golden Years Village wasn't just expensive. It was a corporate machine designed to separate elderly people from their assets as efficiently as possible. I found review after review from families complaining about hidden fees, declined care, and suspicious deaths. One review mentioned a class action lawsuit that had been quietly settled. My children wanted to put me in a place where people went to die quickly and expensively, but more disturbing were the articles I found about elder abuse. Financial exploitation by adult children was apparently more common than I'd realized. The pattern was always the same: concern for the parents' welfare, gradual isolation, claims of diminished capacity, then seizure of assets. They had a playbook, and I'd been following it like a script. The next morning, I was up before dawn, but not in the garden this time. I was in my car, driving to the Golden Years Village to see exactly what they thought I was worth. The facility was impressive from the outside, all gleaming glass and manicured lawns. The lobby smelled like industrial air freshener trying to mask something less pleasant. The woman at reception, whose name tag read Melissa, smiled with the practiced warmth of someone paid to care. "Mr. Hammond, we've been expecting you. Your daughter called to set up the tour." Of course she had. "Actually," I said, "I'm here to ask about canceling a deposit." Melissa's smile flickered. "Oh, well, let me get our admissions director, Mr. Peterson." Peterson was a man in his 50s with expensive teeth and the kind of handshake that lingered too long. He led me to his office, where a file with my name already sat on his desk. They'd been busy. "Mr. Hammond, your family has been very thorough in preparing for your transition. We have your medical history, your financial information. Information you got from whom?" "Your daughter, of course. She has your medical power of attorney." "No," I said quietly, "she doesn't." Peterson blinked. "I'm sorry?" "My daughter does not have my medical power of attorney. No one does. So how exactly did you get access to my medical records?" The silence that followed was delicious. I watched Peterson's face cycle through confusion, realization, and barely concealed panic. There may have been some miscommunication." "Mr. Peterson," I said, standing up, "I think there's been more than miscommunication. I think there's been fraud, and I think you and I both know what happens when care facilities accept false documentation." I left him with that thought and drove home, where I found Tyler's car in my driveway. Round 2. He was waiting on my porch, pacing like a caged animal. When he saw me, his face was flushed with barely controlled anger. "Dad, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Interesting opening gambit. No pretense of concern this time. The mask was finally slipping, and underneath was pure frustration at an asset that refused to cooperate. "Good morning to you too, son. Would you like some coffee?" "I don't want coffee. I want to know why Golden Years Village just called to say you were asking about canceling deposits and making accusations about fraud." His voice cracked on the word fraud, like it physically hurt him to say it. Good. It should hurt. I unlocked my door and walked inside, leaving him to follow. "Because I was curious about what exactly you'd told them about me." "We told them what they needed to know to help you. Help me." The words had lost all meaning, become empty syllables that meant control you and profit from you and dispose of you. My jaw ached from clenching my teeth. "Including medical information you don't have legal access to?" Tyler went very still. In that stillness, I saw the boy who'd been caught stealing cookies, trying to decide whether to confess or lie his way out. But this wasn't about cookies anymore. The silence stretched between us, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. This was the moment. The line in the sand. Dad, you're not thinking clearly. This is exactly what we've been worried about. There it was again. Worried about. Not worried about my happiness, my health, my dignity. Worried about their inheritance disappearing into legal fees and facility costs. What you've been worried about, I corrected, my voice steadier than I felt, is that I might live long enough to spend my own money. The accusation hung between us like a sword. Tyler's face went through several expressions: shock, guilt, anger, calculation, before settling on wounded innocence. It was masterfully done. If I hadn't overheard yesterday's conversation, I might have believed it. How can you say that? Everything we're doing is for your own good. For my own good. The rallying cry of every tyrant in history. My fingers were trembling now, not with fear, but with a rage so pure it felt like electricity in my veins. Tyler, I said, sitting down in Eleanor's chair and looking at my son, really looking at him, for the first time in months. What was the name of your first-grade teacher? What? The confusion in his voice was genuine. He couldn't see where this was going, couldn't fit it into his narrative of senile father needs managing. What? Simple question. What was the name of your first-grade teacher? He stared at me like I'd asked him to recite the periodic table backward. I don't. What does that have to do with anything? Mrs. Rodriguez. She had that classroom with all the plants, remember? She called you her little gardener because you always volunteered to water them. Something flickered in his eyes, a ghost of the boy I'd raised. You came home crying one day because Jimmy Morrison said plants were stupid and boys shouldn't like flowers. Do you remember what I told you? Tyler's voice was smaller now. Dad, I told you that taking care of something beautiful was never stupid, that growth takes patience and love, and that the people who don't understand that are missing something important in their lives. I stood up, moving to the window that looked out on Eleanor's garden. I spent 30 years helping you and your sister grow, watering you with opportunities, giving you the best soil I could afford, pruning away the obstacles that might hurt you. And now you want to uproot me because you've decided I'm no longer useful. When I turned back around, Tyler was staring at his hands. But here's the thing about gardens, son, I said softly. Sometimes the old tree you thought was dying is just getting ready for the biggest bloom of its life. That's when I heard the car doors slamming in my driveway. Rebecca and Blake had arrived. The real test was about to begin. The front door opened without a knock. Rebecca's heels clicked across my hardwood floors like bullets finding their target, Blake's heavier footsteps trailing behind. They'd used their key, the one I'd given them years ago for emergencies. Apparently, my refusal to cooperate constituted an emergency. Dad! Rebecca's voice carried the sharp edge of a prosecutor who'd found her star witness tampering with evidence. We need to talk. Now. She swept into the living room like a storm front, her lawyer's briefcase clutched in one manicured hand. Blake followed, his expression set in the smug satisfaction of a man who thought he was about to foreclose on a particularly stubborn debtor. Tyler shrank back into the couch, suddenly looking less like my conspirator son and more like a child who'd brought bigger bullies to finish a fight he'd started. Good afternoon, Rebecca. Blake. I remained seated in Eleanor's chair, my voice calm as still water. I see you've decided to let yourselves in. Dad, what did you do at Golden Years Village? Rebecca's question came out like an accusation. No preamble, no pretense of affection, just the cold efficiency of a lawyer cutting to the heart of the matter. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was any vestige of the concerned daughter. In her place stood a stranger with my daughter's face, calculating and merciless. I asked some questions, I said simply. Isn't that what responsible consumers do before making major financial decisions? Blake stepped forward, his chest puffed with borrowed authority. Mr. Hammond, I think there's been some confusion about the arrangements we've made on your behalf. On my behalf. The phrase hit me like a slap. This man, this stranger who'd married into my family and apparently decided that gave him voting rights in my future, was speaking to me like I was an employee who'd failed to follow instructions. Blake, I interrupted, my voice carrying a warning that made him pause mid-sentence, I don't recall asking for your opinion. The silence that followed was electric. Rebecca's eyes widened, not at my words, but at Blake's face, which had gone red with wounded pride. In 30 years of marriage to my daughter, Blake had never been challenged in my house. He'd grown comfortable treating me like a client rather than family. That comfort was about to become very uncomfortable. Dad, Rebecca's voice took on that courtroom cadence I'd come to dread. Blake is trying to help. We all are. But you're making it very difficult with these episodes. Episodes. Such a clinical word for refusing to surrender my life without a fight. I felt that familiar electricity in my veins again, but this time it didn't feel like anger. It felt like power. Episodes, I repeated thoughtfully. Is that what we're calling it when I exercise basic consumer rights? You're calling legitimate business arrangements fraudulent. Tyler burst out, apparently finding his voice again. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is? How it makes us look? There it was. The truth, naked and ugly. Not concern for my welfare, but concern for their image. How it makes them look to have a father who won't quietly disappear into institutional care. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 71 years in my joints, but also feeling something else, something I hadn't felt in months. Dignity. Tyler, I said, walking to the mantelpiece where Eleanor's photo sat beside our wedding album, do you remember what you said to me yesterday? Dad, I said a lot of things. You said I was dead weight. I turned to face all three of them, my voice steady as granite. You said I was getting in the way, that I should sit down and stay quiet. Rebecca's face went pale. She glanced at Tyler, then at Blake, who was staring at his shoes. They'd thought I'd forgotten, or maybe they'd hoped I was too senile to remember. So I sat, I stayed quiet, and I listened. I moved to the coffee table where I'd laid out a manila folder that morning. Would you like to know what I heard? The folder contained printouts, lots of them. Financial records, medical privacy law statutes, facility reviews, and a transcript I'd painstakingly typed out from memory of their conversation yesterday. The color drained from Rebecca's face as she saw the papers. Blake took an involuntary step backward. Tyler made a small sound in his throat like a trapped animal. I heard my son say that my losing my mind would make things easier. I heard my daughter discuss relocating me within 30 days. I heard my son-in-law calculate exactly how much money you'd save by putting me in a place where people go to die quickly and expensively. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and panic. Dad, you don't understand. Rebecca started. I understand perfectly. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. I understand that Golden Years Village has a mortality rate 30% higher than the state average. I understand that they've been sued 17 times in the past 5 years for neglect and financial abuse. I understand that they somehow obtained my medical records without my consent, a violation of HIPAA that carries criminal penalties. Blake's face had gone from red to gray. Rebecca's hands were shaking as she reached for her briefcase. I also understand, I continued, pulling out another document, that Blake Henderson, CPA, has been listed as my financial power of attorney on documents filed with 3 different institutions, despite the fact that I've never granted him any such authority. The silence was deafening. Tyler was staring at Blake like he'd never seen him before. Rebecca looked like she was going to be sick. Dad, she whispered, we were just trying to help. No. My voice cut through her words like a blade through silk. You were trying to help yourselves. To my house, my money, my life. I walked to the window that looked out on Eleanor's garden, where 13 years of careful cultivation bloomed in defiant beauty. But here's what you forgot, I said, not turning around. You forgot that dead weight can still think, that obstacles can move, that quiet old men sometimes have very good hearing. When I turned back, all 3 of them were staring at me like I'd grown a second head. The confused, controllable old man they'd been managing was gone. In his place stood someone they didn't recognize. So, here's what's going to happen, I said, returning to Eleanor's chair and sitting down with the authority of a judge taking the bench. Blake, you're going to contact every institution where you've fraudulently claimed to represent me, and you're going to correct those records. Today. Blake started to protest, but I held up a hand. Rebecca, you're going to call Golden Years Village and cancel whatever arrangements you've made. You're also going to return any deposits you've made with my money. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. And Tyler, I said, looking at my son with something that might once have been love, but now felt more like disappointment, you're going to sit down and stay quiet while I decide what to do about the fact that my own children tried to have me declared incompetent so they could steal my life. The word steal hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Rebecca found her voice first. Dad, you can't be serious. You're talking about family. Am I? I asked quietly. Because family doesn't abandon each other in substandard care facilities. Family doesn't forge legal documents. Family doesn't calculate the profit margin of a parent's death. I stood up one more time, feeling taller than I had in months. You want to know what's really irresponsible? What's really getting in the way? I walked to the front door and opened it wide. It's thinking you can plan someone's life without their permission. It's mistaking kindness for weakness. It's forgetting that the man who raised you, who sacrificed everything for your futures, might just have a few surprises left. The cool afternoon air drifted through the open door, carrying the scent of Eleanor's roses. Now, I said, my voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. Get out of my house. 3 weeks later, I sat in Eleanor's garden with my morning coffee, watching Mrs. Chen tend her tomatoes through the chain-link fence that separated our properties. The roses were in full bloom now, their petals heavy with morning dew, and the air was sweet with their fragrance. Peace, I discovered, had a particular sound. It wasn't silence. Gardens are never truly silent. It was the absence of waiting, the absence of dread, the absence of that constant, low-level tension that comes from being treated like a problem instead of a person. The phone had been remarkably quiet lately. No urgent calls about family meetings, no cheerful voices discussing my future like I wasn't in the room, no emergency deposits that needed my immediate attention. Blake had called Golden Years Village the day after our confrontation, his voice shaky as he canceled all arrangements and requested the return of the deposit, my $15,000 that had been set aside for my own good. The facility's administrator had been surprisingly cooperative once I mentioned that I'd be happy to discuss their HIPAA violations with the state attorney general. Money, I'd learned, moved much more quickly when accompanied by the threat of criminal prosecution. Rebecca had sent exactly one text message. Dad, we need to talk when you're ready. I wasn't ready. I might never be ready. Some betrayals carved channels too deep for ordinary forgiveness to fill. Tyler hadn't contacted me at all, which somehow hurt more than Rebecca's lawyer-speak attempts at reconciliation. At least Rebecca was still fighting. Tyler had simply vanished, like a plant that withers when it stops getting what it needs from its roots. But Natasha surprised me. She'd called 2 days after the confrontation, her voice small and shaky. I'm sorry, she'd said without preamble. I tried to stop them, but I should have tried harder. I should have called you. I'd forgiven her immediately. She was the only one who'd tried to defend me, even when it failed. That counted for something. Mrs. Chen looked up from her tomatoes and waved. I waved back, then stood and walked over to the fence. Good morning, neighbor, she said with that gentle smile that had become one of my favorite parts of each day. How are the roses looking? Like Eleanor would be proud, I said. How are your tomatoes coming along? We talked about gardens and weather and small things that mattered more than grand gestures. Mrs. Chen had become what my children had stopped being, family chosen rather than bloodbound. That afternoon, I drove to Harold Brennan's law office downtown. My old high school friend looked older than his years, his hair completely gray now, but his handshake was still firm and his eyes still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. Robert, he said, settling behind his desk with the comfortable authority of a man who'd spent 40 years helping people navigate the legal tangles of their lives. I have to say, when you called about revising your will, I wasn't expecting quite this level of revision. The new document sat between us, 10 pages that represented a complete reimagining of my legacy. Tyler and Rebecca's names appeared exactly once in the revised will, in a section titled Debts and Obligations. They would inherit nothing. Not the house they'd planned to sell, not the investments they'd calculated, not the insurance money they'd been counting on. Instead, they would inherit something else entirely: accountability. The will specified that Tyler owed the estate $25,000 for the down payment I'd given him for his house, plus $8,000 for his failed business venture. Rebecca owed $15,000 for her law school expenses that I'd covered when her student loans fell short, plus another $12,000 for the European honeymoon. Blake and she had charged to my credit card temporarily 3 years ago. With interest compounded annually, as Blake the CPA would undoubtedly calculate with painful precision, they owed me significantly more than they'd ever expected to inherit. "This is thorough," Harold said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the debt calculations. "Are you absolutely certain about pursuing collection from your own children?" "Harold," I said, thinking of Rebecca's voice discussing my relocation timeline, of Tyler saying my mental decline would make things easier. They stopped being my children the moment they started treating me like a commodity. The rest, the house, the investments, the life insurance, everything they'd schemed to inherit, would be distributed to people who'd treated me like a human being rather than a burden. Mrs. Chen would receive the house outright, along with $100,000 for maintenance and taxes. She'd protested when I'd mentioned this, but I'd insisted. She'd shown me more genuine concern in 3 weeks than my children had shown in 3 years. The local animal shelter where Eleanor and I had volunteered would receive $300,000, enough to build the new wing they'd been dreaming about and establish an endowment in Eleanor's name. The remaining funds would create the Robert and Eleanor Hammond Scholarship for students whose families couldn't afford to help them. Students like Tyler and Rebecca had once been before they forgot the value of sacrifice and gratitude. "Are you sure about this?" Harold asked, reviewing the document one final time. "It's not too late to change your mind." I thought of Tyler's voice saying my losing my mind would make things easier. I thought of Rebecca calculating the profit margin of my death. I thought of Blake forging documents with my name on them. "I'm sure," I said. That evening, Mrs. Chen joined me for dinner, a tradition we'd started since what she called the unpleasantness with my family. She'd brought homemade bread and a bottle of wine that we shared while watching the sunset through my kitchen window. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked as we cleared the dishes. "Standing up to them the way you did?" I considered the question seriously. Did I regret discovering that my children saw me as an obstacle rather than a person? Did I regret learning that their love had conditions and expiration dates? Did I regret fighting back instead of quietly disappearing and into the institutional care they'd chosen for me? The answer came without hesitation. "The only thing I regret," I said, "is how long it took me to ask that one simple question." "What question?" "The one I should have asked months ago." I looked out at Eleanor's garden where the roses swayed in the evening breeze. I should have asked myself, what would happen if I stopped being convenient? Mrs. Chen smiled, understanding immediately. "And what did happen?" "I stopped being convenient," I said, "and started being free." Later that night, alone in the house that was mine again, I sat in Eleanor's chair with a cup of tea and a photo album from better days. Pictures of Tyler's first steps, Rebecca's graduation, family vacations when we'd all still liked each other. The sadness was still there, might always be there, but it was clean sadness now, honest grief for something that had been real once, even if it wasn't real anymore. I turned to a picture of Eleanor in her garden, kneeling among the roses with dirt on her hands and joy in her eyes. She'd understood something I was only learning now, that love without respect isn't love at all. It's just need wearing a prettier name. "Well, Elle," I whispered to her image, I finally asked the right question. The roses outside swayed in the night breeze, and I could swear I heard her voice in their rustling. "I'm proud of you, Robert. It only took you 71 years to learn that some battles are worth fighting, even against people you love. Especially against people you love." I closed the album and turned off the lights, leaving only the soft glow from the garden lights illuminating Eleanor's roses. Tomorrow, Mrs. Chen and I were driving to the plant nursery to pick out flowers for the front yard, something bright and defiant that would bloom all summer long. At 71, I was finally learning to plant gardens that were meant to be seen.